Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today, we're going to be tackling something a little different.
Hmm.
It's a topic that's been making waves in the autism community, something called the Autism Mafia.
Yeah.
And before anyone gets any ideas about, guys in pinstripe suits,
Right.
let me clarify. It's not about organized crime or anything like that, thankfully,
Thankfully not.
but it is about power dynamics,
Yeah.
influence, and this pressure to conform to certain viewpoints
Hmm.
within the community. Our main source for this deep dive is going to be a website called Cheap ABA.
Okay.
They've raised some seriously interesting points about, the potential downsides of this whole mafia thing.
What I find so interesting about this term autism mafia
Mhm.
is how it really highlights this
Yeah.
underlying tension that exists, honestly, in so many communities, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do you balance advocating for a specific group of people while still allowing for individual expression within that group?
Yeah.
It's like we're looking at a microcosm of this larger societal debates,
Oh,
right?
total.
About identity, belonging, and I think most importantly,
Yeah.
the right to dissent.
It's funny you should say that because I find it kind of ironic that they even call it the Autism Mafia,
Right.
considering how much emphasis there is on embracing neurodiversity within the autism community.
Right.
So, how did this term even come about? What are we really talking about when we say Autism Mafia?
Yeah, I mean, the term itself is definitely provocative, right? It gets your attention.
Yeah.
And it's often used by people who feel like certain voices
Okay.
or perspectives are kind of dominating the conversation about autism.
Interesting.
They're saying there's this pressure to conform to certain viewpoints, especially when it comes to things like therapies,
Yeah.
organizations, even the language we use to talk about autism.
Yeah.
So it's not about a literal mafia, but
Yeah.
rather
Yeah.
this perceived sense of control,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Or like this enforcement of what's considered correct thinking.
So it's more about the dynamics of power and influence within the community.
Exactly.
And, like we were saying before, it's especially interesting because of how much the autism community values neurodiversity, right?
Absolutely.
The irony is that a community that, prides itself on accepting differences can sometimes struggle with its own internal disagreements and power struggles.
That's so true.
It's just like any other group, really.
Yeah.
You're going to have different opinions and approaches, right?
Right, of course.
But why is this whole mafia idea particularly relevant or even concerning when it comes to the autism community specifically?
Well, think about it this way.
Okay.
Imagine you've just been diagnosed with autism,
Yeah.
or you're a parent who's navigating this world for the first time.
Right.
You're probably looking for information and support.
Right.
You want to know what's best for you or your loved one. But what happens when you're suddenly bombarded with these strong opinions and this
Yeah.
pressure to conform to a very specific viewpoint?
Right.
It can be incredibly overwhelming
Yeah, totally.
and even isolating.
You might even be hesitant to ask questions, right? Or even explore different options.
Exactly.
Just for fear of being judged or ostracized.
Yeah.
Especially when you're already feeling vulnerable and uncertain.
And that's one of the key concerns that Cheap ABA brings up.
Okay.
The potential for this mentality to actually create barriers to getting support and information.
Oh, wow.
People might be afraid to speak up,
Yeah.
share their experiences,
Right.
or even seek help if they feel like they're going against the grain.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
It's like,
So instead of feeling empowered by this community,
yeah,
that's supposed to be about acceptance and support,
right.
you end up feeling silenced or even shamed
Exactly.
for having different views or
Yeah.
making different choices than what's considered acceptable.
And that's precisely why it's so important that we unpack this whole concept, right?
Yeah.
We need to understand what's really going on, all the nuances.
Right.
Because the goal isn't to point fingers or label anyone as bad,
Right.
but to create this space where people can talk openly and honestly,
Mm-hmm.
a dialogue where everyone feels safe to share their experiences and perspectives.
I'm totally with you on that. We definitely need to understand the potential pitfalls of this whole mafia mentality.
Absolutely.
So we can work towards creating a community that's truly inclusive and supportive for everyone, right?
Right. Yeah.
So let's dive into those potential pitfalls.
Okay.
The source actually uses the phrase, the dangers of the autism mafia.
Mhm.
Can you break down some of those dangers for us? What are they talking about?
Absolutely. So the source highlights three main dangers.
Okay.
And I think these are really, really important for us to understand.
Okay, let's hear it.
First, this pressure to conform. completely ignores the incredible diversity that exists within the autism community.
Yeah.
Every single person's experience with autism is unique.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah. What works for one person might not work for another.
Hmm.
There's just no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to support or therapy.
Right. It's like assuming everyone with autism has the same needs and preferences,
Exactly.
which is just not true.
Right, and that's where this mafia mentality,
Yeah.
it can become really harmful.
Yeah.
When you start dictating what's right or wrong for everyone,
Yeah.
you're ignoring this vast and diverse group of people and their individual needs and preferences.
It's like saying there's only one correct way to be autistic, which totally contradicts the idea of neurodiversity.
Exactly.
What else does the source mention as a potential danger of this mafia mentality?
Well, the second danger they point out is this potential for intimidation and shaming.
Oh, okay.
Let's say you publicly express a viewpoint that goes against the prevailing wisdom, right? And this
Mm-hmm.
perceived mafia.
Right.
Well, you might face some backlash. You might be excluded from online groups,
Oh, wow.
harassed on social media, or even ostracized in real-life settings.
That's scary.
It is.
It creates this chilling effect where people are afraid to speak up or be themselves
Right.
because they're afraid of what might happen.
Exactly. And this can be really damaging,
Yeah.
especially for those who are new to the community or already feeling a bit vulnerable and unsure.
I can imagine.
They might be less likely to reach out for help or share their experiences
Yeah.
if they think they'll be judged or ridiculed.
So instead of fostering a sense of community and belonging,
Right.
it creates this atmosphere of fear and judgment. It's
Well-
almost like the opposite of what the community should be about.
Exactly. It's counterproductive to the whole idea of supporting autistic individuals and their families.
What's the third danger that the source brings up?
Okay, so the third one is maybe the most direct consequence of this mafia mentality.
Right.
It's limiting people's access to support. The source argues that this pressure to conform can actually prevent people from getting access to resources
Really?
or therapies that could be beneficial for them,
Wow.
simply because those resources or therapies have been deemed unacceptable by this perceived mafia.
So even if a particular therapy or organization has helped someone in the past, or even if it has the potential to help someone in the future,
Yeah.
it could be like demonized or boycotted
Yeah.
just because it doesn't align with the approved viewpoints of this so-called mafia.
That's the concern.
That's wild.
And it's a serious one because it really comes down to people's ability to get the support they need,
Yeah.
and make informed choices about what's best for them or their loved ones.
Right.
This pressure to conform creates this situation where people are afraid to even consider certain options
Yeah.
or talk about them openly, even if those options could be helpful.
It's like this mafia mentality creates these arbitrary boundaries within the community, right? Limiting people's options and potentially preventing them from finding the support they need.
That's it. And that's why it's so important to have these open and honest conversations
Yeah.
about these dynamics, to challenge the assumptions and make sure that everyone feels safe to explore different options
Right.
and make choices that are right for them without fear of judgment or reprisal.
I couldn't agree more. We need to move away from this idea that there's only one right way to approach autism.
Yeah.
We have to embrace the diversity of experiences and perspectives within the community.
Absolutely. And that leads us to some specific examples of how these autism mafia dynamics actually play out,
Okay.
which we'll dive into after a quick break.
Sounds good. We'll be right back.
All right, so welcome back.
All right, let's get into those examples. You mentioned Autism Speaks and ABA therapy.
Yeah, those are like two big ones, right?
I'm curious about Autism Speaks. They're like a household name at this point. Right?
Oh yeah, huge organization.
What makes them such a target for this whole autism mafia accusation?
Well, it comes down to like a really fundamental difference in how people view autism.
Okay.
The critics, they argue that Autism Speaks, at least historically,
Mm-hmm.
has focused way too much on finding a cure, right?
Oh.
Portraying autism as this tragedy, something that needs to be eradicated.
Wow.
And that clashes big time with this growing movement to embrace neurodiversity.
Right.
Seeing autism not as a disease, but just a different way of being.
So some people feel like Autism Speaks is fighting against autism
Yeah.
rather than fighting for autistic people.
That's the perception, and it feeds into this whole mafia narrative
Yeah.
because
Right.
the people who are aligned with the neurodiversity perspective
Right.
feel this pressure to reject anything to do with Autism Speaks,
Wow.
even if some of their programs or resources might actually be helpful.
It's like they're being told there's only one acceptable way to advocate for autistic people,
Yeah,
and anything else is like a betrayal.
right. That's the danger of this black and white thinking. It
Yeah.
shuts down any nuance,
Right.
and it prevents people from making choices that align with their own values and experiences.
Plus, wasn't there something about Autism Speaks and their leadership?
Oh, yeah, that's another big criticism.
Okay.
They've been called out for not having enough autistic people in leadership positions,
Oh, wow.
which just adds fuel to the fire
Right.
because it reinforces this idea that they're speaking for the community, not with the community.
Makes sense. If you don't feel represented by an organization,
Mm-hmm.
you're not going to trust their motives.
Right. You're less likely to trust them or support their methods.
And then there are like the more specific criticisms, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
I remember reading something about Autism Speaks funding research into genetic testing for autism.
Right. And some people see that as a slippery slope,
Okay.
like it's leading towards a future where parents can just choose to eliminate autism
Oh,
through prenatal screening.
that's heavy stuff.
It is.
No wonder this organization is so controversial.
Yeah, it really sparks a lot of strong feelings.
But even if some of these criticisms are valid, I think the source, Cheap ABA, makes a really good point.
Oh, yeah.
They say this isn't about blindly condemning their organization.
Right.
It's about asking the hard questions,
Yeah,
holding them accountable,
absolutely.
and making sure that their advocacy truly reflects the needs and desires of the entire community.
That's the key.
It's about making sure families have access to good information and support, no matter what their views on autism are.
Exactly. Well said.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about ABA therapy.
Okay, sounds good.
Now, you mentioned earlier that you're a big advocate for ABA, but like, done right.
Yeah, that's important.
What are some of the ways that ABA can go wrong?
One of the biggest criticisms is that some forms of ABA,
Okay.
especially like the older, more rigid approaches, focus too much on making autistic kids act in ways that are considered socially acceptable by neurotypical standards.
So instead of celebrating what makes autistic people unique, it's trying to force them into a box.
That's the fear. And it ties back to this whole Autism Mafia idea, right?
Okay.
Because some people feel like they have to completely reject ABA,
Wow.
even if they've seen it work for their child, just because of this pressure to conform.
It's like this binary, you're either with us or against us kind of thing.
Exactly. Pro-ABA or anti-ABA.
What about the argument that ABA can be traumatic for some autistic people?
Yeah, that's a valid concern.
I've heard stories like kids being forced to suppress their natural behaviors, even if they weren't hurting anyone.
There's definitely a concern about stimming behaviors being suppressed. Things like rocking, flapping hands, repetitive movements.
Right.
These can be really important for autistic people, Self-soothing, essential for their well-being.
Okay.
And some of those older ABA approaches tried to completely eliminate these behaviors, which is where the trauma accusations come from.
So it sounds like it's not ABA itself that's the problem, it's how it's applied. There's a difference between teaching helpful coping mechanisms and trying to erase someone's natural way of being.
That's it. And modern ABA, when it's done right, ethically and compassionately,
Yeah.
it focuses on understanding why a behavior is happening.
I see.
If STEM isn't harmful, we don't try to get rid of it.
Okay.
We might work with the person to help them find ways to STEM that are more socially acceptable or appropriate for a particular situation.
So it's about finding that balance, right?
Yeah.
Supporting the person's needs and well-being while also helping them navigate the social world.
Exactly. Unfortunately, though, this whole autism mafia rhetoric,
Yeah.
it gets in the way of people having these nuanced conversations about ABA,
How so?
Well, parents might be hesitant to talk about their positive experiences
Oh, right.
because they're afraid of being labeled abusive or unaccepting.
That's really unfortunate.
It is. It's like the pendulum has swung too far in the other direction,
Yeah.
creating this new set of pressures and anxieties.
Yeah. So what's the solution then? If it's not about banning ABA completely?
I think the key is to find that middle ground.
Okay.
Respect neurodiversity, but also recognize that some people might benefit from therapies like ABA, as long as those therapies are implemented ethically and with sensitivity to the individual's needs.
Sounds like we need more transparency, more accountability,
Definitely.
and a focus on individualized approaches.
Absolutely. We need to move away from these blanket statements and judgment calls.
And that's where cheap ABA offers some really practical advice.
Yeah, they do.
About how to have more respectful and productive conversations about this stuff.
I have some great tips.
I'm looking forward to hearing them. So we've spent a lot of time talking about this whole idea of the Autism Mafia.
Yeah.
All this pressure to conform to certain viewpoints within the autism community.
Right.
But I'm curious, like, what can we actually do about it?
Yeah, that's the important question, right? What's the takeaway?
Exactly. We've talked about the problems, but what are the solutions?
Well, luckily, the cheap ABA website doesn't just leave us hanging with all these critiques.
Okay, good.
They actually give some pretty practical advice for having better conversations.
Okay, I like that.
More respectful and productive dialogue.
So let's get tactical here. What are their top tips?
Their first point, I think this is like the foundation for everything else,
Correct.
is active listening.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds so simple, right?
Yeah, it does.
But honestly, how often do we really listen to understand?
Oh, man.
Especially when someone has a different opinion than us.
I know, right? It's so easy to get caught up in your own head.
Exactly.
Thinking about what you're going to say next or, like, planning your rebuttal.
You're not really absorbing what the other person's trying to tell you.
Exactly. We're just waiting for our turn to talk, basically.
Right. So they recommend making a conscious effort to just be quiet.
Yeah.
And really focus on what the other person is saying.
Oh, I like that.
Ask clarifying questions.
Right.
Make sure you really understand their perspective before you jump in with your own.
It's like approach the conversation with genuine curiosity.
Yes.
Instead of defensiveness.
Exactly.
It's more like, help me understand why you feel this way.
Yes.
Rather than, here's why you're wrong.
I love that. That's such a good way to put it.
And that leads perfectly into their next point, which is about language.
Oh, yeah.
The words we use.
Words are powerful.
Oh, they can be weapons.
They really are. They can either escalate conflict or de-escalate it.
Mm-hmm. Especially if you're talking about something as emotionally charged as this.
Right. And it's so easy to let your emotions take over.
Oh, for sure.
Especially when we're talking about our kids, our identities.
Yeah.
But we have to be careful not to let those emotions turn into hurtful language.
Right. No name-calling or personal attacks.
Exactly. So instead of saying, like, you're being ignorant,
right.
Try something like, I understand why you feel that way, but my experience has been different.
Yeah, it's like acknowledging their feelings, but still standing your ground.
Exactly.
It's respectful disagreement, which I think is a lost art these days.
I agree. We could all use a little more of that.
So what else does the source recommend?
Okay, this one's really good.
Okay.
They say to focus on shared values.
Okay.
Even when you disagree about specific methods or strategies,
right.
Remind yourselves of what you have in common.
So, like, in the context of the autism community,
yeah,
that might be the desire to see autistic people thrive,
Exactly.
Lead fulfilling lives.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you have different ideas about how to get there.
It's like, hey, we both want the same thing here.
Yeah.
Let's figure out how to work together, even if our methods are different.
I like that. It's about finding that common ground.
Yeah.
It seems like there's a theme here.
What do you mean?
Active listening, mindful language, shared values.
Yeah.
It's all about building bridges instead of walls.
You got it. That's a perfect way to put it.
What's their final tip?
Okay, so this one's something we've talked about a lot already.
Okay.
Embrace the diversity of the autism community.
Right. There's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Exactly. What works for one person might not work for another, or could even be harmful.
Yeah, so instead of trying to force our own beliefs on others, we need to create space for different perspectives and approaches.
Absolutely. Everyone's journey with autism is unique.
Yeah.
There's no single right way to be autistic or support autistic people.
I mean, this all sounds great in theory.
Sure.
But what about when things get heated?
Yeah.
It's easy to talk about respectful dialogue when everyone's calm.
Right.
But emotions can run high, especially with a topic like this.
Absolutely. So here's the thing.
Okay.
If things start to get too intense, don't be afraid to take a break.
Okay. Yeah.
Step away, cool down, come back to the conversation when you're feeling more centered.
Right, because trying to force a resolution when everyone's fired up, it's not going to end well.
It never does. It's like that saying, never send an email when you're angry.
Exactly. Sometimes you just need to step back and get some perspective.
Exactly. When you do come back to the conversation,
right.
Try to reframe it. Focus on finding common ground or compromises.
Okay.
Instead of just digging your heels in.
So be willing to bend a little.
Yeah. Ask yourself, Is there a way we can both get some of what we need here?
And sometimes, the most respectful thing you can do is just agree to disagree.
That's true.
You don't always have to change someone's mind to have a productive conversation.
I think that's a really important point. The goal isn't necessarily to reach total agreement,
Yeah.
but to create a space of understanding and respect.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this conversation?
I think this whole idea of the Autism Mafia just reminds us that even in communities that are all about acceptance and diversity,
Right.
there can still be these internal pressures to conform.
Right. Which is ironic.
It is, but awareness is the first step.
Mm.
And by being mindful of our language,
Hmm.
listening actively, focusing on shared values,
Yeah.
we can create a more inclusive and supportive environment for everyone.
I love that it's a call to action, not a condemnation.
Exactly.
We all have a role to play in making the autism community a more understanding and respectful place.
Absolutely. And the skills we practice here,
Yeah.
respectful dialogue, open-mindedness, empathy,
Right.
those are valuable in any community,
Yeah.
in any relationship, really.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
So to our listeners,
Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep the conversation going.
yeah, but do it with kindness and respect.
And until next time, happy deep diving.